Imagine handing over your life savings to someone you trust, only to realize it was all a lie. Millions of dollars vanished, entire fortunes destroyed. Some promised miracle profits, others too good to be true investments, but all led to the same devastating truth: a trap disguised as opportunity. From a Wall Street legend who scammed the elite, to a preacher who robbed his own church, to the man whose name became synonymous with financial fraud, these are the 7 biggest Ponzi schemes in U.S. history that deceived millions and left chaos in their wake. Stay with us, because the deeper we go, the darker it gets. Bernie Madoff's Ponzi scheme. Bernie Madoff's Ponzi scheme stands as one of the most infamous financial frauds in history, deceiving thousands of investors and causing losses exceeding $65 billion. Madoff, a well-respected Wall Street financier, operated Bernard L. Madoff Investment Securities, LLC, a firm he founded in 1960. Over the decades, he gained a reputation as a financial guru, serving as the chairman of NASDAQ and attracting high-profile clients, including celebrities, charities, and institutional investors. However, beneath the surface of his apparent success lay a massive fraud that unraveled in 2008. Madoff promised consistent and lucrative returns, drawing in investors who believed they were part of an elite and exclusive investment opportunity. His strategy seemed flawless. Investors received steady profits regardless of market fluctuations. What they didn't realize was that Madoff wasn't actually investing their money. Instead, he was using new investors' funds to pay returns to earlier investors, the classic definition of a Ponzi scheme. His deception was supported by fake account statements and sophisticated financial maneuvers that misled clients into thinking their money was growing. For years, financial experts and auditors failed to detect any wrongdoing. Madoff's reputation shielded him from scrutiny, and his firm maintained an air of legitimacy. Even when analysts raised concerns about the impossibility of his reported gains, he brushed off inquiries with vague explanations or outright dismissals. Some, like financial investigator Harry Markopoulos, repeatedly warned the SEC about inconsistencies in Madoff's business, but these warnings were ignored or not properly pursued. The collapse of Madoff's empire came in December 2008, during the financial crisis. As panicked investors sought to withdraw funds, Madoff could no longer sustain the illusion. He confessed to his sons, who then reported him to authorities. On December 11, 2008, he was arrested and charged with securities fraud. The scale of his deception stunned the financial world, and the fallout was catastrophic for his victims. Many had entrusted him with their life savings, while charities and foundations that relied on his profits were forced to shut down. In 2009, Madoff pleaded guilty to 11 federal felonies, including securities fraud, wire fraud, and money laundering. He was sentenced to 150 years in prison, effectively a life sentence. His arrest led to widespread investigations into regulatory failures and how the SEC missed multiple red flags. Madoff's family also faced intense scrutiny. His brother Peter was sentenced to 10 years in prison, while his sons distanced themselves from the scandal, though their reputations were forever tarnished. Tragically, Madoff's son Mark died by suicide in 2010, unable to cope with the disgrace brought upon their family. The aftermath of the Madoff scheme saw years of legal battles as authorities sought to recover lost funds. Irving Picard, the court-appointed trustee, worked to recover billions through lawsuits against banks, investors, and associates who had benefited from the scheme. Some victims received partial repayments, but many never saw their money again. The scandal also led to financial reforms aimed at increasing oversight and preventing similar frauds, though Ponzi schemes continue to emerge in different forms. Madoff's death in 2021 marked the end of a dark chapter in financial history, But his legacy remains a cautionary tale about blind trust in financial institutions. His name became synonymous with financial fraud, a reminder of how even the most sophisticated investors can fall victim to deception. Allen Stanford's Stanford Financial Group fraud. Allen Stanford orchestrated one of the largest Ponzi schemes in U.S. history, defrauding investors out of approximately $7 billion through his offshore bank, Stanford International Bank, SIB. As the founder of the Houston-based Stanford Financial Group, he presented himself as a billionaire banker offering safe, high-yield investments. For years, he lived an extravagant lifestyle, owning yachts, private jets, and luxurious properties, all while convincing investors that their money was secure. However, his empire was nothing more than a massive Ponzi scheme that collapsed in 2009. Stanford's scheme centered on certificates of deposit, CDs, issued by his bank in Antigua. He promised investors returns far higher than what traditional banks offered, claiming that the funds were safely invested in diversified assets. Thousands of clients, including retirees, institutions, and even professional athletes, trusted him with their savings, believing they were making risk-free investments. However, instead of investing the money as promised, Stanford used new deposits to pay earlier investors and fund his lavish lifestyle. For years, Stanford managed to avoid scrutiny, in part due to his influence in political circles. He donated millions to U.S. politicians, throwing lavish parties and cultivating relationships with lawmakers. His financial empire expanded globally, with offices in the U.S., Latin America, and the Caribbean, giving him an aura of legitimacy. His bank in Antigua operated with minimal oversight, allowing him to manipulate financial records and evade regulatory scrutiny for years. Despite concerns raised by whistleblowers and former employees, Stanford continued operating his scheme unchecked. The U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, received multiple warnings about irregularities in his business, but investigations were slow and ineffective. His charismatic personality and seemingly successful operations kept suspicion at bay, even as cracks in his empire began to show. In 2009, the financial crisis exposed Stanford's fraud. As investors tried to withdraw their money, it became clear that the funds were not there. The U.S. government launched an investigation, and in February 2009, federal agents raided Stanford Financial Group's offices. A few days later, the SEC formally charged him with orchestrating a massive Ponzi scheme. Shortly after, Stanford was arrested and indicted on charges including fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. During his trial, prosecutors revealed how Stanford had manipulated financial statements and used investors' money to support his extravagant lifestyle. Unlike Bernie Madoff, who pleaded guilty, Stanford maintained his innocence, claiming he was a legitimate businessman. However, the evidence against him was overwhelming. In 2012, he was convicted on 13 counts of fraud and sentenced to 110 years in federal prison. The aftermath of Stanford's scheme left thousands of investors devastated. Many lost their life savings, and efforts to recover lost funds have been slow and complex. Court-appointed receivers worked to seize and distribute remaining assets, but much of the money was already spent. The scandal also raised serious questions about regulatory failures, particularly how the SEC allowed Stanford to operate for so long despite numerous warnings. Stanford's case highlighted the dangers of offshore banking fraud and the risks of trusting financial institutions that promise unusually high returns. His story remains a stark reminder of how charismatic fraudsters can exploit trust and manipulate financial systems, leaving destruction in their wake. Today, Stanford remains in prison, serving his sentence as one of the most notorious financial criminals in history. Tom Petter's investment fraud. Tom Petters was once a respected Minnesota businessman and philanthropist, But behind his success was a massive Ponzi scheme that defrauded investors of nearly $3.7 billion. His fraud, which operated through his company Petters Group worldwide, involved fake business deals, falsified documents, and promises of lucrative returns. Over the years, he built a reputation as a self-made entrepreneur, acquiring well-known businesses, sponsoring charities, and presenting himself as a legitimate tycoon. However, his entire operation unraveled in 2008 when investigators uncovered the truth about his fraudulent activities. Petters' scheme involved attracting investors by promising high returns on deals that never actually existed. His company claimed to be purchasing large amounts of consumer electronics, televisions, cameras, and other high-demand products to resell to big retailers like Costco and Walmart. Investors were told that their money was being used to finance these transactions and that they would receive a share of the profits once the products were sold. However, none of the deals were real. Instead of using the funds for legitimate purchases, Petters was simply using new investors' money to pay off earlier ones, keeping the illusion of a profitable business alive. For years, Petters managed to deceive banks, hedge funds, and individual investors with falsified purchase orders, bank statements, and business records. His ability to maintain the scam was bolstered by his success in the business world. His company owned stakes in major brands such as Polaroid, Sun Country Airlines, and Fingerhut. He lived lavishly, buying luxury homes, private jets, and expensive art, reinforcing his image as a wealthy and successful entrepreneur. His generosity in charitable giving and political donations also helped him gain credibility, making it even harder for people to suspect wrongdoing. Despite the outward success, cracks in his scheme began to appear. Some investors started questioning the legitimacy of the transactions, and employees within his company began to suspect fraud. In 2008, a whistleblower, Deanna Coleman, one of Petters' closest associates, approached the FBI and provided crucial evidence that exposed the scam. Her cooperation led to a full-scale federal investigation, including wiretaps, surveillance, and raids on Petters' offices. In September 2008, federal agents arrested Petters, charging him with fraud, conspiracy, and money laundering. The investigation revealed that his fraudulent activities had spanned over a decade, with billions of dollars flowing through fake deals. During his trial, prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence, including forged documents and testimonies from former associates who admitted their roles in the scheme. Petters maintained his innocence, claiming he had been set up, but the jury found him guilty on 20 counts of fraud-related charges. In 2009, he was sentenced to 50 years in federal prison, one of the longest sentences for financial fraud in U.S. history. Unlike Bernie Madoff and Alan Stanford, whose schemes had global reach, Petters' fraud was more localized, but still had a devastating impact. Many investors, including charitable organizations and pension funds, lost significant amounts of money, with some never recovering their losses. The collapse of Petters' empire led to efforts to seize and liquidate his assets in an attempt to compensate victims. However, much of the money had already been spent or misallocated. The case also raised questions about financial oversight and due diligence, as many institutions failed to detect the red flags in his business operations. Petters' downfall serves as a warning about the dangers of blind trust in financial figures who appear successful and generous. His story is a textbook example of how greed, deception, and a lack of oversight can allow fraud to persist for years, leaving a trail of financial ruin in its wake. Today, he remains in prison, serving his sentence as one of the most notorious Ponzi schemers in American history. Scott Rothstein's legal settlement. Ponzi scheme. Scott Rothstein, a high-profile Florida attorney, ran one of the most elaborate Ponzi schemes in U.S. history, defrauding investors of $1.2 billion through his law firm, Rothstein Rosenfeld Adler, RRA. Unlike traditional investment scams, Rothstein's fraud revolved around fake legal settlements, making it one of the most unusual financial crimes ever uncovered. His luxurious lifestyle, political connections, and extravagant spending helped him gain credibility, allowing the scheme to flourish for years before it collapsed in 2009. Rothstein's scheme was based on selling investments in what he claimed were structured legal settlements. He told investors that his firm represented clients who had won large settlements in lawsuits, but preferred to take a smaller lump sum payout rather than wait for the full settlement. Investors were promised massive returns, sometimes up to 50% annually, if they provided the funds up front, with the assurance that they would receive the settlement payments directly from defendants in court cases. However, the entire operation was a lie. There were no settlements, no real plaintiffs, and no actual defendants making payments. Rothstein and his associates fabricated legal documents, forged judges' signatures, and created fake court records to make everything appear legitimate. To keep the scheme running, he used new investors' money to pay earlier ones, all while funneling huge sums into his extravagant personal lifestyle. Rothstein lived like a king, spending millions on mansions, luxury cars, yachts, and an extensive jewelry collection. He was known for throwing lavish parties and making large political donations, particularly to Republican candidates, which helped him gain influence and protect his fraudulent empire. His firm, RRA, grew rapidly, hiring dozens of lawyers and expanding its presence in South Florida. Many people assumed his success was genuine, never suspecting that his wealth was built entirely on deception. Despite his efforts to maintain the illusion, cracks in the scheme began to appear in late 2009. As the financial crisis deepened, investors started demanding their promised payouts. Rothstein struggled to keep up with the payments, and soon his entire operation unraveled. In October 2009, he fled to Morocco, where he attempted to seek asylum, but realizing his options were running out, he returned to the U.S. and turned himself in to federal authorities. In December 2009, Rothstein pleaded guilty to 5 federal charges, including racketeering, conspiracy, and wire fraud. He cooperated with investigators, providing evidence that implicated his co-conspirators and detailing how he had orchestrated the scheme. In 2010, he was sentenced to 50 years in federal prison, one of the longest sentences ever given for a financial fraud case. The fallout from Rothstein's fraud was devastating. Dozens of employees at RRA lost their jobs when the firm collapsed. Many investors lost millions, including some who had placed their entire life savings into his fake settlement deals. Authorities worked to recover funds by seizing his assets, auctioning off his collection of exotic cars, luxury watches, and waterfront properties. His political connections also came under scrutiny, as some of the money he had donated to campaigns was later returned or seized by the government. Rothstein's case exposed major gaps in legal and financial oversight, as few regulators questioned how a law firm could promise such outrageous returns. His fraud serves as a stark reminder that even highly respected professionals in positions of power can exploit trust and manipulate the system for personal gain. To this day, his Ponzi scheme remains one of the most shocking legal frauds in American history, demonstrating how greed, deception, and arrogance can bring down even the most seemingly successful individuals. Reed Slatkin's Church of Scientology investment scam. Reed Slatkin, a co-founder of the early internet service provider Earthlink, ran a Ponzi scheme that defrauded investors of $593 million between the 1980s and 2001. His fraud targeted fellow Church of Scientology members, close friends, and business associates, making it one of the most notorious affinity fraud cases in history. Slatkin, who had no formal investment training, convinced his victims that he was a financial genius capable of delivering massive returns. However, he was simply using new investors' money to pay earlier ones, while siphoning off millions for himself. Slatkin's rise to prominence began in the 1980s, when he presented himself as a savvy investor with exclusive access to lucrative financial opportunities. He used his status as an ordained minister in the Church of Scientology to gain the trust of other members, many of whom eagerly invested their savings with him. Over time, he expanded his scheme to include Hollywood elites, technology executives, and wealthy entrepreneurs, leveraging his growing reputation and connections to attract more money. Slatkin promised extraordinary returns, often doubling or tripling investments within a short period. Investors believed they were participating in exclusive, high-yield investment opportunities that weren't available to the general public. To maintain the illusion, he provided falsified account statements showing massive profits, even though there were no real investments. Whenever an investor requested a withdrawal, he simply used funds from new investors to pay them, keeping the scheme afloat for years. His credibility skyrocketed after he co-founded Earthlink in 1994, which became one of the leading internet service providers of the late 1990s. His association with a successful tech company gave him even more legitimacy, allowing him to attract even wealthier investors. Many assumed that his wealth and financial expertise came from his role in Earthlink, not realizing that his real fortune was built on fraud. The scheme began to unravel in 2001 when the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, started investigating his investment activities. As pressure mounted, Slatkin declared bankruptcy, exposing the extent of his deception. The investigation revealed that he had been running a classic Ponzi scheme, with little to no actual investments backing his supposed profits. Over 800 investors, including high-profile celebrities and business leaders, lost millions in the collapse. In 2002, Slatkin pleaded guilty to fraud, conspiracy, and money laundering. He admitted to fabricating financial records and misleading investors for over 15 years. In 2003, he was sentenced to 14 years in federal prison, though he was later released in 2013 after serving only 10 years. The aftermath of Slatkin's scheme was devastating for his victims. Many had trusted him not only as a financial advisor, but also as a friend and fellow Scientologist. The scandal also damaged the reputation of the Church of Scientology, which faced scrutiny over how Slatkin was able to exploit members of its community. Legal battles continued for years as authorities attempted to recover and distribute what remained of his assets, but many victims never saw their money again. Slatkin's fraud serves as a cautionary tale about affinity scams, in which fraudsters exploit trust within a particular religious, social, or professional community. His case highlights how even seemingly successful entrepreneurs can be engaged in financial deception, using personal relationships and reputations to manipulate their victims. His Ponzi scheme remains one of the most infamous in U.S. history, a stark reminder that even those who appear wealthy and well-connected can be operating elaborate financial frauds behind the scenes. Gerald Payne's Greater Ministries International Ponzi Scheme. Gerald Payne, the leader of Greater Ministries International, GMI, orchestrated one of the largest faith-based Ponzi schemes in U.S. history, defrauding investors out of $500 million. Operating under the guise of a Christian ministry, Payne and his associates promised miraculous financial blessings to thousands of churchgoers, convincing them to invest their life savings in what they believed was a divinely inspired wealth-building program. The scheme preyed on religious faith, exploiting trust and devotion for financial gain. Payne and his wife, Betty, founded Greater Ministries International in Tampa, Florida, during the 1990s. Posing as devout Christians, they used biblical references and religious rhetoric to lure believers into their investment program, known as the Double Your Money Plan. They claimed that God had revealed to them a system that would multiply donations, promising that those who invested in GMI would see their money double within a short period, thanks to divinely guided investments in gold, mining, and international trade. The scheme targeted devout Christians, particularly members of small churches who trusted GMI as a faith-based financial institution. Investors were reassured that their money was being used to do God's work, with Payne often quoting scripture to justify the program. The promise of spiritual rewards alongside financial returns made it difficult for many to question the legitimacy of the operation. GMI used churches, revival meetings, and word-of-mouth referrals to recruit new investors, creating an expanding network of victims. For several years, GMI flourished as early investors received payments from new deposits, reinforcing the illusion of a successful operation. Payne and his associates lived lavishly, purchasing expensive homes, luxury vehicles, and private jets, all while portraying themselves as humble servants of God. GMI even established a church, a publishing company, and a radio station to promote its fraudulent activities under the guise of religious outreach. However, concerns began to emerge as some investors failed to receive their promised payouts. When individuals started asking questions, Payne dismissed doubts as a test of faith and warned that skeptics were interfering with God's plan. Some church leaders raised concerns, but many followers continued to believe in the ministry, unwilling to accept that they had been deceived. In 1999, the U.S. government launched an investigation into Greater Ministries International. Authorities discovered that the entire operation was a Ponzi scheme, with little to no actual investments backing the promised returns. When the scheme collapsed, thousands of churchgoers lost their savings, many of whom had invested retirement funds and life insurance payouts. Payne and several of his associates were arrested and charged with fraud, conspiracy, and money laundering. During the trial, prosecutors exposed how GMI had falsified financial records, misled investors, and laundered millions of dollars through offshore accounts. Payne refused to admit guilt, insisting that he had been following God's plan and that he was being persecuted for his faith. In 2001, he was sentenced to 27 years in federal prison, while his wife, Betty, received a 12-year sentence for her role in the fraud. Several other GMI leaders were also convicted and given lengthy prison terms. Despite their claims of innocence, the evidence showed that they had knowingly defrauded their followers, exploiting religious belief for personal enrichment. The Greater Ministries International scandal devastated thousands of families, many of whom lost everything they had. The case also highlighted the dangers of affinity fraud, particularly in religious communities where trust and faith can be manipulated for financial exploitation. The scandal led to increased scrutiny of religious organizations involved in financial ventures, but similar schemes have continued to emerge over the years. Payne's fraud remains a sobering reminder of how greed and deception can infiltrate even the most sacred institutions. His case stands as one of the most egregious examples of financial fraud in the name of religion, showing how even faith can be weaponized to orchestrate one of the most devastating Ponzi schemes in American history. Charles Ponzi's original Ponzi scheme. Charles Ponzi is the man behind one of the most infamous financial frauds in history, the Ponzi scheme, which now bears his name. In 1920, he defrauded thousands of investors out of what would be over $250 million in today's money. Though his scheme lasted just over a year, it set the blueprint for countless financial frauds that followed. Ponzi promised extraordinary returns through an arbitrage system involving international postal coupons, but in reality he was simply using new investors' money to pay off earlier ones. His operation collapsed spectacularly, leaving thousands of people financially ruined. Ponzi was an Italian immigrant who arrived in Boston in 1903, determined to make a fortune. After years of struggling with low-paying jobs and even serving time in prison for check forgery and smuggling, he stumbled upon an idea that he believed would make him rich. His scheme was based on international reply coupons, IRCs, a type of postal voucher that could be bought in one country and redeemed for stamps in another. Ponzi claimed he had discovered a way to profit from exchange rate differences by buying IRCs cheaply in Europe and selling them for a higher price in the US. In 1919, he started his own company, Securities Exchange Company, and began convincing investors that his system could generate 50% returns in 45 days or 100% in 90 days. The idea seemed legitimate, and people rushed to invest, believing they had discovered a risk-free way to make money. Early investors received their promised payouts, which made the scheme appear even more credible. Word spread rapidly, and soon thousands of people, ranging from working-class immigrants to wealthy businessmen, were handing over their savings to Ponzi. However, the arbitrage system was a complete fabrication. While Ponzi may have initially attempted to profit from IRC trading, it was impossible to execute at the scale he promised. Instead of generating real profits, he simply used money from new investors to pay earlier ones. As more people invested, the scheme snowballed, bringing in millions of dollars per week. At the height of his operation, Ponzi was making up to $15 million a day, an unimaginable sum at the time. With his newfound wealth, Ponzi lived lavishly. He bought a mansion, wore custom-tailored suits, and traveled in luxury cars, reinforcing his image as a financial genius. He even donated generously to charities, further enhancing his reputation. Investors lined up outside his office, eager to hand over their money, convinced that Ponzi had discovered a brilliant financial loophole. However, cracks in the scheme began to appear. Journalists and financial analysts started questioning the logistics of his operation, pointing out that the number of IRCs needed to sustain such profits did not exist. The Boston Post launched an investigation, revealing that Ponzi had a criminal past and that no evidence supported his claims of IRC trading. Investors, sensing trouble, began demanding their money back, creating a liquidity crisis that Ponzi could not handle. In August 1920, authorities raided his offices and found that Ponzi had only a fraction of the funds needed to cover investor payouts. He was arrested and charged with fraud, facing multiple counts of larceny and financial misconduct. During the trial, it was revealed that he had defrauded over 40,000 investors, many of whom lost their life savings. In 1921, he was sentenced to 5 years in prison for mail fraud. But after serving his sentence, he was indicted on state charges, leading to an additional 9-year sentence. After his release, Ponzi was deported to Italy, where he lived in relative obscurity. He spent his later years in poverty, working odd jobs before ultimately dying in Brazil in 1949, a broke and forgotten man. The collapse of Ponzi's scheme remains one of the most legendary financial frauds in history. It exposed the dangers of get-rich-quick schemes and highlighted how charisma, deception, and public greed can sustain a fraud for far longer than logic would suggest. His name has since become synonymous with fraudulent financial schemes, and Ponzi schemes continue to appear worldwide, proving that the lessons of his scandal have not been fully learned.